Peter said about the importance of this agenda, and that's something we're very aware of at UniversitiesUK. Before I start, just say a little bit about me. I'm Director of Policy at UniversitiesUK, so I have oversight of all of our policy work at UUK. And as you can imagine, it's a very sort of interesting and busy time for us, and we deal with a whole range of issues, and this is one of the key areas that we're dealing with at the moment. Social mobility in higher education. There's a strong political interest. Notwithstanding whatever happens with the election, I think it's not going to go away, and higher education is going to be seen as central to this agenda. So in terms of my presentation, I'm just going to say a little bit about what the data says. It's not going to be an extensive sort of look at the data. There's a lot of analysis in the report that Peter mentioned that we published in October, and I'll say a little bit more about that report. But in terms of the sort of analysis of the current state of play, it's probably worth looking at that. But I want to just pull out a few things and try and answer this question about, are we there yet? And that will give us a sort of little bit of an indication. And then look at some of the current challenges as we see them, and that's really some of the things that we surfaced in the report that we did and published last year. And then off the back of that, say a little bit about what we're doing and how we want to take that forward. And actually in the discussion afterwards, it would be really good to have a discussion with you about how you can support our work, how we can support what you're doing, and how we can sort of bring some of those things together in a consistent way. So sort of building on some of Peter's points, starting with the positives really, and really looking at social disadvantage. What does the data currently tell us? Well, in terms of the positives, it shows us that certainly in terms of Polar Quintile 1, the 18-year-old application rate is at record levels. So actually, we are seeing significant increases in the participation rate for the most disadvantaged students or advantaged applicants as measured by Polar. And we've seen significant increases in that over the last 10, 11 years. And the gap between the application rate for 18-year-olds from the most advantaged and least advantaged groups is also at its lowest levels. And we're seeing that gap closing. So in terms of the application rates, actually there's a very positive story there. And that's reflected in terms of entry rate as well. So this is the proportion offered and accepted by UCAS, and that data, national level for England, shows us a similar picture. And we've had the highest year-on-year growth in 2016, up 5%. And also the ratio between quintiles 1 and 5 is its lowest level that we've seen. And at the bottom there, the 18-year-old entry rates for the higher tariff institutions is also up, and the gap is closing. And it's also important to recognise this growth has taken place during quite significant change in higher education, particularly the tripling of fees since 2012. And we've seen a steady increase and steady positive in terms of the data, notwithstanding quite significant changes within the sector, not only in terms of the fees and the fees that students are paying, but also the significant change that we've had to see in the sector itself in terms of responding to that and a more marketised environment. I think these positives are mainly a testament to significant work done in the sector by yourselves and your colleagues, and also the substantial investments that are made by institutions and by government and funders. And at the moment, for example, access agreement expenditure is just short of £1 billion a year, and that was a figure that was highlighted in our Social Mobility Advisory Group report. But that's not to be Panglossian about it, and that's not to say there aren't challenges ahead. The gaps are still large, and our report showed that progress is still relatively slow, and also appears to be slowing. And also, obviously, we use the Polar measure in higher education, but it doesn't tell us everything. And if you use different measures, such as free school meals, it shows us a different sort of picture, and it also shows a slower growth, and the growth in participation, if you look at individual characteristics, is rather than populations, is actually slightly lower and slower. I think the gap between the different groups has also increased, and the ratio has gone up for the first time since 2006. And those not receiving free school meals were just over 2 times more likely to enter, and that's up from last year. And the higher tariff rate entries are still small, and there's significant progress that needs to be made on that front. And also there's different disparities between groups, as Peter said. If you break it down by ethnicity and sex, it also shows quite different pictures. An example I've given here is for 18-year-old men from white and mixed ethnic backgrounds, entry rates 36% below the rates for 18-year-old women from Chinese ethnic backgrounds. So it highlights that different ethnic groups and significant challenges remain, particularly in terms of white working class boys, but also close behind that are the challenges around white working class girls and also mixed race. When you bring in free school meal status as well, that widens even more. White 18-year-olds of both sexes have entry rates under 10%, and mixed race boys are only slightly above that. And again, location plays a big part, and we see it's not just in terms of the different groups, but also in terms of region. And this is just a map of sort of significant differences across parliamentary constituency across the country. So there's challenges. I presented some of the more positive data in terms of the national picture, but in terms of the challenges, there are obviously challenges and different challenges which you'll all be very aware of in your own regions as they map onto region. So the previous slides have given us a national level overview of how we're doing, and I think they show a mixed scorecard in terms of the sector, notwithstanding the significant effort and the significant investment that goes in at the sector. And in relation to that, UniversitiesUK was asked to examine some of the main priorities and some of the challenges, and then identify how progress could be made. This work went way beyond access and explored the whole student life cycle. And again, coming back to some of Peter's comments, that's sort of one of the main focuses really at the moment, is moving away from access to looking at the whole life cycle in terms of supporting people to get good outcomes from their degree, but also benefit from that degree in terms of the employment market. And the Social Mobility Advisory Group was established to look at these issues in depth and reported at the end of last year. And I just want to say a little bit about some of the things that they presented and how they see some of these challenges, and how the Social Mobility Advisory Group feels some of these challenges can be addressed. In terms of the objectives of the Social Mobility Advisory Group, I think looking at access and participation was only one part of it. And if you look at these broader objectives, there was quite a significant range of other issues. Obviously improving access for white working class boys, increased number of BME students, but also looking at some of the challenges, particularly for BME groups, around improving outcomes and returns on graduate employment, and also reducing barriers and improve outcomes for disabled students, and some of the wider issues about how the different sort of understanding of the data about disadvantage in different groups stacks up. But also we widened, and coming back to Peter's point, we widened this out as well. The government were interested in those 6 areas, but we were also interested in saying, well, actually, we need to move away from the perception that people only have one chance to study at university at the age of 18, and what role can universities play in social mobility beyond the sort of traditional entrance, and can we move away from thinking about traditional modes of delivery as well, and different sort of ways in which higher education will be consumed, and the role that might play in terms of supporting some of the objectives around participation, access, and supporting graduate outcomes. So we saw mature students very much as part of those objectives as well, even though they weren't explicitly set out by the Minister. So what did the group find? I'm going to give a very high-level summary, and I'm happy to sort of go into this in a bit more detail in discussion, because it was a very long report. I don't know if any of you have read it, but it was sort of getting on for nearly 100 pages. But in some of the headlines are, well, there's no one solution, and I think that's in many ways very obvious, but it was important we were able to make that point and say, well, look, there's diversity of challenges in terms of different groups, different regions, different ways in which some of these might be addressed. And actually there's a wide range of interventions that are required. There's no silver bullet here, and I think often that's quite an important message to get across. It's a difficult message sometimes to sell, but it's an important message to get across to politicians who are looking for quick interventions and quick wins. I'm not saying that there might not be those. Socioeconomic disadvantage is the most significant driver in inequality in terms of access and outcomes from HE. And also age poses different challenges, including, as I've said, the importance of making available flexible study and different modes of delivery for being able to sort of consume higher education. And also place very much matters, and the growth of regionalism, localism and different structures in those regions is a really important factor. As I've already said, the group found that access is only part of the challenge. It's important to take a holistic view, even when only looking at one or more parts of that system. Access is a major issue for white working class, however, not, as I've already said, not the main issue for BME. More work is needed to raise standards across schools and work with schools and addressing the attainment gap. Often I think we've said the issue is about attainment, and sometimes I think that's perceived as a bit of a sort of the university sector washing its hands of this issue and saying, well, actually the problem is in school. I think the Social Mobility Advisory Group felt, well, yes, that is true, but actually we need to be thinking about ways in which we can work with schools to raise standards. I mean, that may not just involve sponsoring schools. There's a whole sort of wide range of areas in which universities are and can work with schools, but nonetheless it was seen as an important part of the solution. And then building on that, I think collaboration was seen as key, particularly with schools, but also other actors within the education system, but also those actors, for example, in the third sector that are working with universities, and obviously you'll be working with them as well. And then I think lastly it was important about engaging employers, and we found there was a much stronger appetite for employers to engage in these issues. I think, as we've already heard from Peter, traditionally I think a lot of the debates have been around access and participation, but actually opening up that discussion with employers to understand, for example, how can we get a common understanding of what disadvantage is? How can we all be having the same conversation about using data sets and supporting the different interventions we have? So responding to that, there's 6 sort of main themes in terms of the recommendations we proposed. Smarter and better use of data. This was really about joining up the different data across the different parts of the education system to allow us to take a slightly more holistic view of disadvantage and understand what the challenge is. Part of that was actually from institutions saying, we want a slightly better, we want population-based data, but also we want to look at individual characters perhaps in a basket of indicators that gives us a better understanding. A key thing that cut across all of the areas I've talked about, relationships with schools, the work that universities are doing, the work that you're doing, was actually getting better at understanding what works, understanding what's the sort of efficacy of the interventions that we are making. I think there's a moral question and a sort of value for money question here. We're putting a lot of money in on the value for money. How do we know we're getting the returns that we think we're getting? But also a moral question. If we're engaging with people and we're getting them to sort of take part in various schemes and various initiatives that we're developing, there's a sort of moral question to make sure that their time and the effort that they're engaging with produces value. So there's a real focus on developing a more systematic approach to understanding what works and how we can develop, for example, controlled trials around different interventions that can inform decision making and inform investments within institutions. Getting better at promoting, some of these are perennial questions, but getting better in terms of promoting information, advice and guidance and communicating that. The role of league tables, and obviously the potential disincentive that league tables might have in terms of recruiting those from more disadvantaged backgrounds. Institutional practice and looking at a number of the sort of areas that universities are developing. This comes back to the issue around evaluation and what works. And then working with employers to really understand how we can sort of equalise things in terms of graduate outcomes. Those are broad themes in terms of the recommendations. I wanted to say about specific projects that we're taking forward off the back of this in summary. Exploring how we can address the challenges in graduate outcomes. We're taking very much a regional focus on this with an emphasis on careers advice. And looking at what universities are doing, how are they working with other actors within the education system, within a particular region, different actors within that region, the LEP, for example, and how they're working with employers, and what interventions are working, and how can we support these and develop these and promote good practice. And what we want to do is look at a regional level, a bit more of a deep dive in terms of how that's working, and really try to get under the bonnet of this and understand what works and how we can support it, and then potentially share that practice across regions, develop pilots and effectively audits of other regions, or provide toolkits that people can use. And how the second one is, how does a relationship with schools need to develop and evolve? I think this in part is driven by a political imperative, as you will know in the green paper that was published on schools last year, and also reflected in the Conservative Party manifesto. There's a very strong focus on raising attainment in schools and the role of universities, but particularly through the lens of, obviously, school sponsorship. And what we want to do is say, look, there's a wider bandwidth here. There's more that universities can do. Yes, school sponsorship is part of it, but actually there's a lot more that universities can do. And we want to set out a bit more of a clearer prospectus about how we think that relationship should be developed, supported, and evolved. Evidence and data. What we want to do is take some of these challenges around better evaluation, better use of data, a more systematic approach to understanding what the impact of interventions is, and develop that into something called an evidence and impact exchange. And there's a very strong appetite for that at the moment politically, of something that could sort of act as a central repository, central place where some of this analysis could take place. It could be driven by the needs of users, be they employers, be they people in institutions, and also thematic based, for example, looking at the interventions in schools or different outreach activity, and then promote that out to the sector. And it goes beyond the idea of sort of best practice or good practice, and actually says this is what the evidence says. And that's been developed in other sectors. We've got the Education Endowment Foundation in schools, and we've also, for example, the College of Policing have done a very similar thing as well. I think we'd also, as I've said earlier, we'd like to develop a broader basket of indicators that help institutions understand disadvantage, and that's something we're very committed to working with. And also we want to bring league table compilers together to start examining what some of these disincentives are and how they can be understood and mitigated. And then lastly, we want to develop a programme of work that is more proactive in promoting the efforts of what the sector's doing at a national level. I think we feel often we're slightly on the back foot. We've seen this with the issues around schools and the narrative around schools. We've slightly lost the narrative on that. What can we do to say, look, this is what the sector's doing, and promote that politically with opinion formers through the media, etc. And that's something we're committed to doing. Now lastly, I just want to sort of say a little bit about, given we've got an election coming on, election on today, I want to say a little bit about the political context we're operating in. And I think whoever wins the election, this issue isn't going to go away. It's going to be a primary focus. If we have a Conservative majority, I think the issues will be around the development of the relationship between schools and making sure that isn't seen as something that's too narrow or force institutions down a particular route, which could actually be quite damaging. And I think there's likely to be a focus on white working class males, which Theresa May obviously indicated in her speech when she took up Prime Ministership last year. I think there's also something about the recent terrorist events and the issues of exclusion and disadvantage within certain communities, and I think actually the university sector is probably something a bit more proactive it can say about that, rather than perhaps it being just about prevent, actually saying, well look, this is the role that universities can actually play in terms of dealing with some of these issues around exclusion and disadvantage in certain communities. If we see a Labour majority or a coalition, I think obviously the big question is how we can sustain the sector to continue its work in this area. There will be some quite significant and quick, if they're able to achieve it, shifts in the way in which funding is allocated. And I think if there are ultimately going to have to be limits on what the public purse can afford. And I think there will be challenges about whether you can actually sort of have an uncapped system. And my view is that if you have to, because there's limits on the public purse and what you can afford, if you have to put the cap back on student numbers, I think that could be hugely damaging for the work of the sector in terms of widening access and opening up the sector. And then obviously there's the ongoing issues around the challenge of how the OFS will develop off the back of the Higher Education and Research Act. We're still going to, whoever wins the election, we've still got the HE and Research Act. But I think the complexion of how OFS will develop will change and differ, and the role of the Director of Fair Access within that will change as well. So that's a bit of a sort of canter over the territory, but I'm happy to take questions on any of those points.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, so thank you, Chris, for that. I think for that, those perspectives, particularly on the work that you are doing coming out of the advisory group report, and also I think your perspectives on possibly what might happen today, are particularly valuable for us. So I'd like to kick us off now with our first question. Have any particular questions or comments for Chris to kick us off? So, lady in the third row. You can have the microphone. There you are, man. You can say who you are and where you're from as well, please.
Thank you. I'm Barbara Kenkamp from the Lifelong Learning Centre at University of Leeds. And my question is, if adults and mature learners are part of the solution, how is it going to be possible to continue their support if the funding is all going to be diverted into working with schools rather than personal bursaries and the likes that now WP funding is also allowing us to, and they play a key role in attracting adults or facilitating adults study at university.
I think that's a really important point, which is why we've made quite a forceful sort of contribution to this. It says, look, if you force universities into working with schools, particularly in terms of school sponsorship, that's quite costly, and that will stop them doing other things, because they'll have to focus on that to meet their access requirements, or whatever, or however they choose to do it. So I think there are real dangers and there are real risks, and I think we've still got, given what was in the manifesto, we've still got quite a way to go to get that message across. But we're absolutely committed. We've got work in place that straight after the election we'll get straight in there with MPs, with others to make that case. I think there's also something about universities trying to get the message out. I mean, there's a wider agenda about the skills and how we're going to meet the skills needs of the country, particularly given sort of demand for high-level skills. And I think there's a wider issue about universities getting the message out about how they're diversifying provision, how they're developing different and alternative pathways into university. Now, a lot of universities are doing that. There's probably more they can do, and how they're developing more sort of partnerships with other parts of the education system, and obviously through one of the things that's been proposed by the government are the sort of institutes for technology, with universities working more with FE colleges. So I think the sector's probably got quite a lot to say about how it can step up to that challenge and what that might mean in terms of support and funding from government to help it do that. And I think that again, it's probably an area where the sector's slightly on the back foot. But I mean, at the heart, I agree with your concerns, and we'll try and do everything we can to get that message out.
Next question. Julie. Microphone to you. Right, so microphone.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It was really interesting, and I will read the paper. My question was very specific to league tables and metrics in current league tables. And sorry, I should say I'm from University of Sheffield, and my name is Julie Askew. Currently, we don't really look at added value for WP cohorts of students in terms of their attainment or their exit velocity, and I'm not sure whether we ever will. It would be nice if we did.
Yeah.
How hard will you push on implementing new metrics that would directly measure the performance of universities with respect to their support for WP students? Because we hear all the time university leaders telling us, well, of course our reputation is really important for international recruitment, and league table positions are key to that. So it strikes me that we need some extra metrics so that they retain a good position, but within that position they're also measured against their WP performance.
Yeah, I think I'd agree. And that actually was pretty much the tone of the recommendation in the Social Mobility Advisory Group report. And And obviously, as you know, league tables don't really include anything about universities' performance in this area. There's two issues. One is that they don't include anything on universities' performance, but also the sort of disincentives around the tariff scores and potentially lowering those would sort of have an impact in your position in the league table. So there's two issues there. I think we need to have a discussion with the league table compilers. I guess the league table compilers, they're independent organisations and they can do what they want. But, so we can't say to them that this is what we think you have to do, but we can try to have a more constructive discussion with them about what we think they should do and try and push that discussion forward. And I'm sort of quite hopeful that we can have that discussion with them. And some of the discussions we've had would indicate there is a little bit of a willingness to come around the table and talk about this. But whether that would actually lead to new metrics, I don't know. So I'm not sure if I can answer that at the moment. But also, obviously, we've got the TEF as well, and I'm not going to predict what the impact of the TEF, but some of these things are included in the TEF. So that could have an impact, and that could actually create a different sort of environment where, people are more conducive to having that discussion about including different sorts of metrics. But there's still a big question mark over the TEF and what impact it's going to have. So I wouldn't want to say the TEF's going to sort of drive a change in this area.
The back.
Hello, David Cozy, University of Kent. Just wanted to ask a bit about retention in particular. So one of the things that obviously is going really well is that we're recruiting more students from WP backgrounds, but I think some of the structures that still remain in universities and across the sector aren't always geared up to support those in the way that might be right for them, should I say. So what does the data tell us about how we can best retain those students? Because I'm really interested to find out, and I don't know a lot about that.
Yeah, I mean, the data shows us where the challenges are, particularly in relation to different groups, and I think the data shows that there are sort of challenges in terms of student disabilities and from BME backgrounds in terms of retention. That's probably where, I'm not saying there aren't challenges of retention for other groups, but that's probably where the priority is. I'm not sure if I can say specifically, and you probably sort of better to answer this question than I, about what the interventions are that are most effective. But what I would say, this is part of the reason why we want to develop this sort of what works centre around this area and social mobility, is to actually perhaps get more systematic about understanding what the impact of interventions are. Not only saying, look, here's all the available data out there, let's do a systematic review of it, try to draw some conclusions and say, look, this is what we think works, but also identify where the gaps are in terms of the evidence, or get better at using the data so that the data can be used as a tool to allow us to understand how we're doing and measure which interventions are the most effective or not. So it's almost trying to create a bit more of a step change to understand that, because at the moment people will be doing things and there'll be lots of practice across the sector, but is that systematically reviewed and understood what the impact is? In many cases, some of the people we've spoken to say, well, actually, we're not, we do our own evaluations, but we're not quite sure, for example, we haven't done a comparative analysis about the efficacy of these interventions. So I think there is a bit of a way to go in the sector, not just in regards to retention, but also wider intervention. I know HEFCE and OFFA and others are sort of pushing this, but I think we want to try and bring all that together and push it forward. And as I said, the government are very interested in it. It's developed in other sectors, such as policing, education sector. So I think there's potential there, but it will take a while to get it going and embedded. I mean, it'd really be interested in, as per my question actually, what you as a community would want from something like that.
Question in the corner. Then we'll take one more and then it's time for lunch.
Alex Blow, University of Southampton. Thank you very much for the talk. It was really interesting. One of the things that really kind of shone out to me when you were looking at the statistics was the percentage of people from non-traditional backgrounds in high academic institutions. I was at a UCAS conference recently and they were saying that in terms of percentages of students undertaking qualifications post-16 and BTECs for the first time over the last couple of years have really started to outweigh A-levels. Now, in my experience with admissions policies with high average Russell Group type institutions, then a lot of the qualification. Now, if that's pretty symptomatic from across all higher tariff institutions, is there any work that UUK or UPA could undertake that would help to redress that balance? Because in terms of kind of a structure and equality for access to higher education, then that's a very, very big one for those students from non-traditional backgrounds who might, without realising right from the start, be taking on qualification.
It's a really important question. And we've also seen a growth in those people taking BTECs, and I think actually the A-level population is sort of abnormal in as much as it's sort of skewed more towards the more advantaged groups, whereas BTEC is more representative of the population as a whole. So naturally there are more people doing BTECs who are from disadvantaged backgrounds. And I think often there's been an issue of perception with BTECs. I think the evidence that I've seen shows that those people who come into universities doing BTECs are better at unsupported learning and independent learning, but less good when it comes to exams. And there have been some changes with BTEC as well recently, where I think 40% of the assessment is now going to be external, more kind of exam-based, which I think might help with that. And also I think, that move is to deal with perceived grade inflation in terms of BTECs. And that might actually help in terms of the sort of confidence that the sector has, and admissions tutors and others have, around accepting people from BTEC. So there are some moves that could actually help with BTEC. There is, and on your last question, there is a study which I think the University of Exeter is undertaking to look at what different interventions are needed to support BTEC students throughout the student life cycle. And I think there could be some really interesting things coming out of that, which I think should be shared across the sector. And I think that work will report in September. So I think, I completely agree with you. I think BTEC will be an essential part of it. And also, I think as we're developing different pathways and a more of a focus on technical education and technical routes, it's a sort of, that general qualification is quite a good flexible route into different pathways through higher education. So from a broader perspective, to meet the skills challenges, it's going to be quite essential as well.
Thank you. One more question, then we'll have to go quick for lunch, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much, Chris. Louis Coiffé from Reform. I think it's really useful, the comparison with the Education Endowment Foundation and their Teaching and Learning Toolkit. If I think about my role as a governor, it's quite useful to be able to compare the strength of evidence and the impact of different interventions, but the third column is also the cost. I just wondered, as part of the work you did with the group, how much data is out there and how kind of standardised is it about the cost effectiveness of different interventions?
It's a good question. I'm a school governor as well, and I use EEF, and it's valuable, and that's sort of, I think a lot of people recognise those sort of toolkits are very, very important. This is part of the challenge. I don't think a lot of it is standardised. I think we're getting better at that. And as I've said, some of the work that Hefty's done, and some of the work that Offer is doing as well, is pushing in that direction. But I'm not sure we have that sort of standardised, systematic approach to some of these things. And also, the data is going to be pretty critical in this area, because that allows us to understand the sort of efficacy of these interventions, and a lot of the data we might need isn't quite joined up in the way it could be. And there's a big opportunity from higher education going into DFE, because you can start sort of thinking about how those schools' data sets and pupil data sets can be matched up. And I know some of that's happening already, but actually we could really use those developments through this kind of mechanism to allow people to get a better sense of how they can use that data to understand their own developments and whether they're effective or not, and measure them themselves, like the EF toolkits.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, I know some people want to get questions in, but I'm afraid I don't want to eat into lunch too much. Are you able to stay around for lunch?
I'll stay around, yeah.
So I'm sure Chris is around for lunch. I'm sure he's happy to pick up individual conversations. Thank Chris again for answering our questions.